It began with a sound that didn't belong on a battlefield. Not a gunshot, not an explosion. A voice, weak, broken, almost polite. Bitte. Private Jack Turner didn't realize he'd stopped breathing until his lungs burned. He stood frozen at the edge of a shell crater, rifle raised, finger resting against the trigger guard, staring down at the shape half buried in snow and mud 10 yards ahead of him. The German soldier was sprawled awkwardly, one leg twisted beneath his body, his greatcoat torn open and dark with blood. Steam rose faintly from the wound where shrapnel had torn through flesh and muscle. The Ardennes forest was silent in that eerie way that only came after prolonged shelling, when even the birds seemed to know better than to make a sound. Smoke hung low between the trees. Snow fell slowly, almost gently, as if the world were trying to pretend it wasn't tearing itself apart. Jack Turner had been trained for this moment. They all had. Enemy combatant, wounded or not, finished the job. His squad leader's voice echoed in his head from earlier that morning, sharp and impatient. Don't hesitate. Hesitation gets people killed. Jack had nodded along with everyone else. He'd fired at targets. He'd marched. He'd learned how to keep moving when the man next to you dropped without a sound. He'd told himself over and over that when the moment came, he'd do what needed to be done. But now the moment was here, and the enemy wasn't reaching for a weapon. The German soldier's helmet lay several feet away, split clean through. His rifle was nowhere in sight. His hands, bare, trembling, were raised slightly, palms open, fingers stained red. Bit, the man whispered again. Please. Jack swallowed. His mouth felt dry and metallic. Somewhere behind him, artillery boomed again, closer this time. The war was still very much alive, still hungry. It would not pause for this. He took a step forward. Turner! Someone hissed from behind a tree. What the hell are you doing? He didn't answer. The German's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but terrified. He couldn't have been more than 19. Younger than Jack, maybe. A kid who should have been worrying about school or girls, or whether he'd ever get out of his hometown, not whether a stranger was about to decide if he lived or died. Jack's rifle shook. This wasn't how the war was supposed to feel. He'd grown up in a small town in Ohio, the kind where everyone knew everyone else, and Sundays meant church whether you believed or not. His father had fought in the last war and never talked about it. His mother cried quietly the day the letter came, but she packed his bag anyway, folding his shirts with care, slipping a Bible between them without saying a word. Do what's right, she'd said at the train station, hugging him too tightly, even when it's hard. Jack had thought he understood what that meant. Now he wasn't so sure. The German soldier coughed, blood bubbling at his lips. His raised hands trembled, then sagged back into the snow. Something in Jack snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet internal shift, like a door closing on a path he could never walk again. He lowered the rifle. He didn't think. If he'd thought, he might have stopped. Instead, he slung the weapon over his shoulder and dropped his knees beside the wounded man. The cold seeped instantly through his trousers. He tore open his medical pouch with numb fingers, the smell of iodine sharp in the air. What are you doing? His squad leader demanded, emerging from cover, eyes wild. Turner, get back here. Now! He's bleeding out, Jack said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. He's not armed. That's not your problem. Jack pressed a bandage against the wound. The German gasped, clutching weakly at his sleeve. Their eyes met. Fear, raw and unmistakable. Bit, the man whispered again. I know, Jack murmured, though he didn't speak German. I know. The squad leader grabbed Jack's collar and yanked him backward. Have you lost your damn mind? You think this is some kind of charity mission? Jack looked up at him. Snow clung to his eyelashes. His hands were slick with blood. If we leave him, he dies. And if you stay, you might get us all killed. The words hung between them, heavy and true. Jack hesitated only a moment longer. Then he pulled free, dragged the wounded soldier toward a shallow depression in ground, and waved frantically toward the rear lines where medics might see. Gunfire cracked nearby. Someone cursed. Someone else laughed nervously, the sound brittle and wrong. Eventually, the medics came. The German was lifted onto a stretcher, his eyes never leaving Jack's face until they disappeared into the smoke. The squad moved on. No one said a word. At first, Jack thought that would be the end of it. A strange moment in a long, brutal war. Something to carry quietly and forget if he could. The forest swallowed their tracks. New orders came down. The front shifted, as it always did. But war doesn't forget. 2 nights later, the ambush came. It was textbook perfect. Machine guns opened up from positions the Americans believed were clear. Mortar rounds dropped with devastating accuracy. The first man went down screaming. The second never made a sound at all. Jack fired blindly, heart hammering, snow exploding around him as bullets tore through branches overhead. Men shouted. Someone prayed. Someone else cried out for his mother. 7 Americans were dead in under 15 minutes. Afterward, as they counted bodies and gathered weapons with shaking hands, Jack noticed the looks. They weren't subtle. Whispers followed him like shadows. Conversations stopped when he approached. No one sat near him when they ate. His friend from basic training, a kid named Ellis who used to share cigarettes and talk about home, wouldn't meet his eyes. That night, Jack lay awake in his foxhole, staring up at the pale sky, the sounds of forest pressing in on all sides. He replayed the moment over and over, the raised hands, the whispered plea, the bandage soaked through with blood. Had he doomed them? He told himself there was no proof, no certainty, but doubt crept in anyway, quiet and relentless. The lieutenant didn't say anything outright. He didn't need to. Jack was reassigned to point positions, to patrols that ventured farther out than usual. Dangerous work, necessary work, the kind that thinned ranks without drawing attention. When Jack asked why, the lieutenant only shrugged. Someone has to do it. Weeks passed. Winter deepened. The war ground on. Then the papers came. Dereliction of duty. Endangering the unit. No treason charge. That would require evidence. This was cleaner, easier. The hearing was brief, procedural. Jack stood alone before a panel of men who didn't look at him for very long. No one spoke in his defense. No one mentioned the Geneva Convention. No one talked about wounded prisoners or raised hands or mercy in the snow. The verdict came down in a tone as flat as the landscape outside. Reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, transfer to a penal unit. Jack nodded because there was nothing else to do. That night, he wrote a letter home and tore it up before dawn. He never mentioned the German soldier. He didn't know how. The transfer happened at dawn, without ceremony. Jack Turner was marched away from his unit with a canvas pack slung over one shoulder and a rifle he no longer felt entitled to carry. No one shook his hand. No one said goodbye. A few men watched from a distance, faces unreadable, as if afraid that acknowledgement itself might be contagious. The penal unit waited several miles behind the front lines, in a clearing carved out of blackened trees and churned mud. It wasn't marked on most maps. It didn't need to be. Everyone knew what it was for. Men who had failed. Men who had been inconvenient. Men who could be spent. The officer in charge didn't bother learning names. He scanned Jack once, noted a reduction in rank on his papers, and pointed toward a row of sagging tents. "You follow orders here," he said flatly. "You move when told. You don't ask questions. If you're lucky, you live long enough to be reassigned. If not," he shrugged, "that's war." Jack nodded again. It was becoming a habit. The first assignment came that same afternoon. Mine clearing. No equipment beyond a bayonet and a length of rope. No armored vehicles. Just men spaced 10 yards apart, walking slowly across frozen ground that might or might not explode beneath their boots. Jack focused on his breathing. Step. Pause. Step. The snow hit everything. Wires. Pressure plates. Death waiting inches below the surface. Each footfall felt like a question the earth might answer violently. The man 2 spaces to Jack's left didn't get an answer, just a sound like the world tearing in half. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left to recognize. No one stopped walking. That night, Jack sat alone near the edge of camp, hands shaking too badly to light a cigarette. He stared at the dark tree line, half expecting the German soldier to step out of the shadows, whole and unhurt, like a ghost conjured by guilt. He wondered if the man was alive. He wondered if it had been worth it. The days blurred together. Clearing minds, drawing fire, advancing first, retreating last. The penal unit moved like a shadow across the front, absorbing danger so regular units didn't have to. Men disappeared constantly. Sometimes there were bodies. Sometimes there weren't. Jack learned to keep his head down, to move when told, to survive without being noticed. He stopped trying to make friends. Attachments were liabilities here. Still, mercy followed him like a curse. Once, during a nighttime patrol, they stumbled across a German foxhole hastily abandoned. Inside, Jack found a wounded soldier barely conscious, his legs shattered, blood frozen stiff against his uniform. The officer with him glanced down once and raised his pistol. Jack said nothing. He turned away. He listened to the shot echo through the trees and felt something inside him go quiet and cold. By February, rumors of the war's end drifted through camp like smoke. The Germans were retreating. The Rhine was close. Victory felt inevitable now, which somehow made everything worse. Men died for ground no one would remember. Orders grew sloppy. Commanders rushed. On a gray morning thick with fog, the penal unit received orders to advance toward a small ridge overlooking a supply route. Intelligence said it was lightly defended. Jack had learned not to trust intelligence. They moved just before dawn. The first mortar round landed short. The second didn't. The explosion lifted Jack off his feet and threw him into a shallow ditch. His ears rang. Dirt rained down. He lay stunned for several seconds, staring at the pale sky, thinking absurdly of home, of the sound of church bells in winter, of his mother's hands folded in her lap. Then someone screamed. Jack scrambled upright and crawled toward the sound. A man lay twisted against a fallen tree, his leg mangled beyond recognition, blood pumping in dark bursts with every heartbeat. Shock had already set in. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. "Help me," the man whispered. Jack pressed his hands into the wound, tearing fabric, trying to slow the bleeding. He shouted for a medic, though he knew none were coming. Penal units didn't get medics. The man's grip tightened around Jack's sleeve. "Don't leave me." "I won't," Jack said and meant it. Gunfire intensified. German troops had the high ground. Orders came down the line, retreat. Fall back. Now. Jack stayed. He dragged the wounded man inch by inch toward cover, bullets snapping overhead. The smell of cordite thick in the air. He tied off what he could with a belt. Packed snow into the wound to slow the bleeding, murmuring nonsense just to keep the man conscious. By the time they reached relative safety, the retreat was already complete. Jack was alone. He felt it before he saw it. The sudden absence of noise, the eerie quiet that settled like a hell breath. The ridge loomed ahead, dark shapes moving at its crest. German soldiers. Jack froze. They hadn't seen him yet. Or maybe they had and were watching, waiting. The wounded man in his arms went limp. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, then gently lowered him to the ground. He reached for the man's dog tags, fingers slick and clumsy, and slipped them into his pocket. Proof, he thought distantly. Proof someone had been here. Footsteps crunched behind him. Jack turned slowly. The German soldier stood 10 yards away, rifle trained on his chest. Another figure emerged beside him. Then another. They were young, tired, faces gaunt and hollowed by months of retreat. One of them spoke in halting English. "Drop the weapon." Jack didn't move. "I said, I'm not armed," Jack said, spreading his hands. His rifle lay several feet away, half buried in snow. "There's a wounded man here. He needs help." The Germans hesitated. One of them glanced down at the body. Another muttered something Jack didn't understand. Then the man who had spoken before lowered his rifle. Slowly, carefully, he approached the wounded American, knelt, and checked for a pulse. He shook his head. "He's dead," the German said quietly. Jack felt the words like a blow. He nodded once. They stood there in silence, enemies bound together by exhaustion and loss. The German looked at Jack more closely now. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You," he said, "you helped one of ours. Before. In the forest." Jack's breath caught. "What?" The German gestured his own side, tracing a scar through his coat. "Medic told us. American soldier. He lived." Jack stared at him, heart pounding. He survived? Yes. Something inside Jack loosened. Not relief exactly. Something heavier. Something that hurt. The German stepped back and motioned to the others. They spoke briefly among themselves, voices low. Then the leader turned back to Jack. "Go," he said. "This way." Jack didn't move. "Why?" The German's expression hardened. "Because this war is almost over," he said. "And because you did not shoot." They let him walk away. Jack didn't run. He didn't look back. He followed the path they indicated until the trees swallowed him whole. When he reached American lines hours later, filthy and shaking, the officer on duty stared at him like he'd risen from the dead. "Where the hell have you been?" Jack opened his mouth. Then he closed it. "I got lost," he said. The report filed later listed Jack Turner as wounded and recovered. No mention was made of the Germans. No questions were asked. The war moved on. Weeks later, Germany surrendered. The camp erupted in celebration. Men drank. Men cried. Men fired rifles into the air despite orders not to. Jack stood at the edge of it all, watching, feeling strangely hollow. He was discharged quietly. No ceremony. No apology. His rank was never restored. He went home on a crowded train, staring out the window as Europe slid past in ruins and fields just beginning to turn green again. At home, his mother hugged him and cried and told him how proud she was. His father shook his hand and said nothing, which somehow meant more. Jack never told him the whole story. Years later, a letter arrived from overseas, forwarded to the Red Cross. The handwriting was careful, uncertain. It was from a man named Lucas. He wrote about surviving the war, about becoming a doctor, about a scar that ached in cold weather, about an American soldier in the snow who had chosen mercy. Jack read the letter once. Then again, he folded it carefully and placed it in his Bible. He never received a medal. His name never appeared in any book. But somewhere in the world, a man lived because Jack Turner had lowered his rifle. And that, Jack decided, would have to be enough. Jack Turner thought the war would end all at once. He imagined a clean break, celebration, relief, the weight lifting from his chest in a single moment. That wasn't how it happened. The war didn't leave him suddenly. It receded slowly and unevenly, like a tide that exposes wreckage you didn't know was there. At first, it was small things. He woke in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced he'd heard someone whisper his name. He flinched at the sound of engines backfiring. He avoided snow whenever he could, crossing the street rather than walk through a drift that reminded him too much of frozen forests and blood that wouldn't soak in. People asked questions in careful ways. Did you see much action? Was it as bad as they say? Jack learned to smile, to give answers that satisfied without revealing anything. He talked about weather, about bad food, about missing home. He never talked about mercy. He never talked about the moment when lowering a rifle had changed the direction of his life in ways no order ever could. He took a job at a machine shop outside town. Honest work. Loud enough to drown out his thoughts most days. His hands were good with tools, steady, precise. That steadiness surprised him at first. He'd expected to feel broken. Instead, he felt anchored. On Sundays, he went to church with his mother. He sat in the same pew he'd occupied as a boy, listened to the same hymns, watched sunlight filter through stained glass. When the pastor spoke about forgiveness and grace, Jack kept his eyes down. Those words felt heavier now, more demanding. Sometimes, late at night, he took out Lucas's letter and read it again. The paper was creased and soft from use. Lucas wrote sparingly, carefully, as if afraid of saying too much. He wrote about medical school, about treating civilians, about nightmares that hadn't gone away, about guilt that didn't belong to one side or the other. In the final paragraph, Lucas had written, "I do not know if what you did was brave or foolish. I only know that because of you, I am alive. And because I am alive, others are too. Jack folded the letter and put it back. That was the closest thing to an answer he ever received. Years passed. The town changed slowly. New families moved in. Old ones moved on. The war became something people spoke about in past tense, with a reverence that sanded down its sharpest edges. Every so often, Jack saw headlines about medals awarded decades late, about wrongs finally acknowledged. He read them without bitterness. He didn't expect his name to appear. He wasn't sure he'd want it to. Recognition felt like a language he no longer spoke. Once, at a 4th of July parade, a man in a crisp uniform shook his hand and thanked him for his service. Jack thanked him back and meant it. The exchange felt complete, even if it said nothing of what mattered most. The hardest moments came unexpectedly. A boy at the shop lost 2 fingers in an accident. Jack was the first to reach him, pressing cloth to the wound, speaking calmly, doing exactly what needed to be done. Later, when the ambulance had gone and the floor was scrubbed clean, Jack locked himself in the restroom and sat on the tile until his breathing slowed. Mercy, he learned, wasn't a single decision. It was a habit, and habits didn't end when wars did. In the winter of 1963, a letter arrived from Germany, not from Lucas, from his wife. She wrote to tell Jack that Lucas had died suddenly, an illness that moved too fast for even a doctor to outrun. She thanked Jack for giving her the years she'd had with him. She told him there were children, grandchildren, even. Jack sat at the kitchen table long after he finished reading, staring at the grain of the wood. Snow drifted past the window, soft and silent. He felt the old ache then, not regret, not pride, responsibility. The understanding that one choice, made in a moment of fear and clarity, had rippled outward through lives he would never meet. He stood, went to the bedroom, and retrieved the Bible his mother had packed so carefully decades earlier. Inside, between the same worn pages, he placed a new letter, 2 pieces of paper, 2 lives intersecting across enemy lines. That night, Jack slept without dreaming. When he grew old, people described him as quiet, kind, dependable, the kind of man who showed up early and stayed late, who listened more than he spoke. No one knew why he paused sometimes before making decisions that seemed simple to others. No one knew why he looked at strangers, as if measuring something invisible. On his last winter, confined mostly to a chair by the window, Jack watched snow fall again. His hands were thinner now, spotted with age, but still steady. His mother was long gone. His father, too. The town felt smaller than it once had. A nurse asked him once if he had any regrets. Jack considered the question carefully. "No," he said finally, "just memories." She smiled, thinking she understood. When Jack Turner died, there was no headline, no ceremony beyond a modest service attended by family, neighbors, and a few men from shop. A flag was folded. Words were spoken. No one mentioned a forest in Europe. No one mentioned a wounded enemy soldier. No one mentioned a rifle lowered instead of fired. But somewhere far away, in another country, there were people who carried on because Jack Turner had chosen mercy when the world demanded violence. History never recorded his name, but history isn't only written in books. Sometimes it's written in scars that heal, in children who are born, in lives that continue quietly because someone once refused to pull a trigger. And that is the price and the power of mercy in a world at war. If you want to uncover other classified attempts that textbooks ignore, subscribe to the Redacted War Archive. We are just getting started decoding the black ink